Iran claims it has killed more than 80 Americans after firing ballistic missiles at U.S. military targets in Iraq. The missiles reportedly hit two bases, the Al-Asad air base in western Iraq and another near the city of Erbil in the north. The U.S. Defense Department says it's still assessing the full extent of the damage. Iran's Revolutionary Guard says the attack was in retaliation for the U.S. assassination of General Qassem Soleimani on Friday. Well, for the very latest from Iran, let's cross over to journalist Reza Katz, who is in Tehran. Reza, we've heard from Iran's President Hassan Rouhani this morning. The country's supreme leader, Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, has also been speaking. What have they said about the attack?
Well, this morning, the leader said that the retaliation, the revenge was just a slap in the face of the U.S. The missile strikes last night or early this morning were not that big. He said that the final and ultimate revenge is to kick the U.S. out of the region, and said that it will be the absolute revenge for General Soleimani's assassination. The president also said later today that the U.S. removed the hand of General Soleimani from his body, and in retaliation, Iran and, of course, its allies in the region will cut off the U.S. feet from the region.
Okay, so Iran's leaders clearly want the U.S. out of the region. Iran's foreign minister, Mohammad Javad Zarif, however, tweeted that his country had taken and concluded proportionate measures in self-defense, adding, "We do not seek escalation of war." Reza, do you think that's really the end of it from Iran's side?
At least the military response is the end of it. There will be no more military attacks, as I heard from the country's officials, against the U.S. interests in the region. Of course, that depends on the U.S. response. If Trump remains so calm after the Iranian attacks, and if there are no casualties as claimed by the U.S. and Iraqi officials, there will be no more escalation, at least in military terms. But I heard that Fars News close to the IRGC was reporting a few minutes earlier that the number of casualties has even increased, more than the 80 people Iran claims have been killed in the attack, and over 200 people, the U.S. soldiers that have been wounded in the missile strikes last night. And it says that all of them have been transferred out of the Asad air base through using choppers. But we should see the assessment of the casualties, where it will go, and we should see if anyone has been killed or not.
Okay, when you say the IRGC, the Iran Revolutionary Guard Corps you're referring to there, they're saying there's been casualties, but we don't have any confirmation either from the Iraqis or the Americans that there have been any casualties. If there are none, is that going to satisfy the desire for revenge from those angry crowds we've seen on the streets in Iran?
Well, of course, I don't think Iran would change its account of the attack and the casualties. Iran will insist that its intelligence and experts say that more than 80 people have been killed, and the U.S. is lying, of course. But we should wait and see how the nation will respond, whether it will be satisfied by this attack and the missile strikes or not. But of course, it was a significant response to the U.S. As Iran's defense minister said earlier today, it was an attack on a U.S. military base that they said, the Trump administration said, they had spent a huge amount of money on it. And it was, of course, a U.S. territory. So it is indeed an Iranian attack on a U.S. base, the U.S. territory. So it is important still, even without casualties.
Journalist Reza Katz there in Tehran. Thank you very much for talking with us. Now, for some analysis, let's bring in Natasha Lindstaedt. She's a Middle East expert at the University of Essex in England. Thanks for joining us, Natasha. We now have Iran's response to the killing of its top general, but that's really not the end of the story, is it? Where do you think this conflict between the U.S. and Iran will go from here?
Well, I think we have to look at Trump's tweet, all is good or all is fine. He may be signaling that he doesn't think that Iran's response was over the top or trying to provoke him. He may think that there weren't that many casualties so far. I mean, we don't know. He did circumvent the command structure by tweeting before the military had a chance to assess how many casualties they are. He might have been really worried that the damage could have been much worse, but he seems to be indicating that he doesn't think it's going to be that bad. Now, if that's the case, he might not respond immediately, and there may be a time for a tactical pause here, and he may reach out and try to engage with Iran. That would be the absolute best case scenario. The worst case scenario would be if he overestimates what the response was and decides to engage in some sort of tit-for-tat situation where there are drone strikes and then Iran responds and then it keeps carrying on like that, upping the number of casualties. But hopefully the tweet indicates that the U.S. thought that Iran had a contained response, and therefore this doesn't require the U.S. to respond to it.
Okay, the response we've seen from Iran is the response from the Iranian state. They're saying that this was proportionate and they've concluded their response. But what about Iran's proxy groups like Hezbollah in Lebanon, militias still operating in Iraq who revered Soleimani, the dead Iranian general? Could there still be a response from these proxy groups?
Of course, and that's what whether or not they decide to do it on their own or whether or not they just decide to engage in some kind of attack with Iran's blessing or Iran's direction. That's been what Iran has used for the last several decades. They've used these proxy militias to attack U.S. interests and U.S. allies. And that was what Soleimani was sort of the architect of, using these types of militias. So there's no way we can tell whether or not they're going to also engage in some kind of attack. But it's likely that they will get involved if this escalates.
Natasha, thank you very much for speaking with us. That was Natasha Lindstaedt there. She's a Middle East expert at the University of Essex in England.
Thanks for having me.
Well, let's get some response now, some reaction from Europe. Our correspondent Terry Schultz is standing by for us in Brussels. Terry, what has the reaction been from EU leaders to the Iranian missile strike?
Well, Terry, the EU response has largely been unchanged over the last couple of days, despite these dramatic developments overnight. European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen called an urgent cabinet meeting this morning, which had already been scheduled, and she came out of it with no condemnation of the Iranian missile strikes, and that's something that will not be well received in Washington. Several European Union governments have condemned the airstrikes, but not the European Commission nor the European Council at this point. So I think that will be something that will be noticed by the Trump administration. Now, what Ursula von der Leyen says is that the EU has a long tradition of keeping communications open in the region. Of course, they do have direct talks with the Iranian regime, and that is what she says are going to be the immediate plans of the EU.
The current crisis deeply affects not only the region, but all of us. And the use of weapons must stop now to give space to dialogue. We all are called upon to do everything possible to rekindle talks, and there cannot be enough of that. The European Union, in its own way, has a lot to offer. We have established and time-tested relations with many actors in the region and beyond to de-escalate the situation.
So the EU keeping the channels of communication open. That's Ursula von der Leyen, the EU Commission President, also former defense minister here in Germany, should add. Now, she says that the EU can maybe do something. What can the EU do to de-escalate the situation?
Well, interestingly, as I mentioned, von der Leyen and Foreign Policy Chief Josep Borrell came out and simply said they're going to keep talking. They didn't give any more concrete measures than that. The European Union has invited Iranian Foreign Minister Javad Zarif to Brussels and has also called an urgent foreign ministers meeting for Friday. So perhaps Zarif will make his way to Brussels for that foreign ministers meeting, although we haven't had that confirmed yet. And so I think that the EU really does feel that as one of the trusted negotiators with the Iranian regime and very much wanting to keep this nearly dead Iranian nuclear deal alive, they feel that is their role here because, of course, Washington and Tehran do not speak. And I think that that's what they feel is going to be this important role. But it was very interesting that von der Leyen said she had very fruitful discussions in her cabinet meeting this morning, but didn't give us any more than that and didn't take any questions from journalists about just what these next steps would be.
So the EU may have a role here as mediator and with diplomatic efforts, back-channel diplomatic efforts perhaps. Now, Terry, you're there in Brussels, which is also where the NATO headquarters is. I know you also cover that beat. What consequences do you think these developments that we've just witnessed will have for NATO troops in the region? Because there are NATO troops still in Iraq.
That's right, Terry. There is a non-combat training mission where NATO and many European governments were helping the Iraqi military professionalize its armed forces, working on administration. And there were about 500 people in the NATO training mission. And now about half have been moved out of Baghdad, as other countries have also done, because of the fear of escalating violence. I'm not sure whether that will change today after the Iranian missile strikes on U.S. bases. But it is key to note that the American forces there in Iraq do serve as a protective force also for other coalition members. And so that very much will affect what European governments do with regard to the security of their own personnel in Iraq on that training mission. So we may well hear more announcements today that forces are being moved away from Baghdad.
So NATO forces is already being taken out of Iraq, and maybe they'll be drawn down further. Of course, we don't know yet exactly what the fallout from that missile attack was, whether there have been any casualties. Iran claiming there has been. The U.S., we're still waiting for them to give their assessment of the damage and any casualties. But as the U.S. is the leading member of NATO, if the U.S. goes further into this conflict, could it end up dragging other NATO countries in as well?
Well, Terry, whether it goes further in or further out, you're right. It will affect all other countries on the ground. It's typical, as we've seen in Afghanistan as well, that the U.S. does lead on this. If the U.S. pulls out, other countries are forced to do so because they need the security, the protection of U.S. forces on the ground there. So I think, as you mentioned, we do need to find out whether there were casualties on the ground. If it could possibly be true, as Iran is claiming, that there were 80 American casualties, that will change significantly the tenor of everyone's discussions here. If there were 80 Americans killed, I can't see any way that it won't escalate. If that's not true, perhaps things will calm down. Again, we just don't know that. And the EU is very much trying to reach out and communicate with the Iranian regime, to bring the Iranian foreign minister here, to hear from him, and to try to convince the Iranians not to continue retaliation. Again, the U.S. will not be pleased with these very even-keeled statements out of the European Union that all sides need to de-escalate, that there should be no more conflict, no more weapons used on either side. So, in fact, we may see an escalation of rhetoric between the U.S. and Europe, as much as we'll see in the Middle East on the ground.
Terry, thanks very much. DW's Terry Schultz in Brussels. Well, here in Berlin, we're joined now by our political correspondent, Simon Young, who has been tracking the response in Berlin. Simon, how has the German government reacted to Iran's airstrikes in Iraq?
Well, Terry, it's both condemnation of the Iranian airstrikes and also calls for calm and de-escalation. The German Defense Minister, Annegret Kramp-Karrenbauer, said that she condemns these attacks in the strongest terms and wants to use every diplomatic means to bring some calm to the situation. And that sentiment was echoed by Foreign Minister Heiko Maas, who says that he is in contact with all sides sides to try and de-escalate the situation. Some politicians here have been voicing the concern that there could be, a further ramping up of the conflict, that it could spread somehow around the region. And in particular, there are calls for the EU to do all it can, to use its influence to prevent that from happening.
Now, Germany doesn't have that many troops in Iraq. They've just over 130, I believe. Some of them have already been withdrawn. Can we expect the rest of them to come out now, too?
Well, the defence minister was asked about that today, and she said that they're considering that possibility. Planning meetings are being held within the defence ministry and the military staff to decide whether the remaining just over 100 training personnel who are stationed in Erbil in the Kurdish north should be moved. And that, of course, is one of the locations where one of these rocket attacks hit. But the defence minister said that the decision taken to move 30 training personnel from central Iraq, from near Baghdad, yesterday was the right one in view of these developments overnight.
Now, we just heard from Terry there in Brussels that the European Union is talking about cultivating some of the diplomatic channels with the region to Iran, I suspect. What is Germany doing specifically on the diplomatic level in this situation?
Well, as I say, Germany says it wants to use all diplomatic means to bring calm to the situation, and it's talking about being in permanent contact with all the other partners in the international military coalition in the region, and it has also called specifically for a meeting of the lead countries of the international coalition to decide what measures they can take. Also, of course, through NATO and the European Union to get the talking going and stop the fighting.
Just briefly, Simon, relations between Berlin and Washington have not really been that warm since the Trump presidency began. What does this conflict between the U.S. and Iran mean for those relations?
Well, I think it brings a further source of tension, but the German defence minister today, when asked about this impact on relations with Washington, said that, Germany stands shoulder to shoulder with all its allies. And she also talked about, again, the possibility of raising concerns in the international organisations, in particular NATO. So if there are concerns about what Washington has been doing, Germany may be doing that through those forums.
Simon, thank you so much. That was DW political correspondent Simon Young.